There is a quiet tragedy running beneath modern life, one subtle enough to be overlooked, yet powerful enough to shape almost every decision we make. It is the illusion that we should be able to control everything that happens to us. We cling to this belief not because we are foolish, but because uncertainty frightens us in ways we rarely admit. The unpredictable nature of existence threatens our sense of safety, so we build elaborate mental systems to convince ourselves that we're steering the ship, even when the ocean is far too vast, too wild, too indifferent to notice our hands on the wheel. We tell ourselves that if we think carefully enough, work hard enough, anticipate problems early enough, we can prevent chaos from reaching us. And when life defies those expectations, as it inevitably does, we feel a deep, almost embarrassing misery, as though our suffering is a sign of personal failure. We grow up being taught that control is synonymous with responsibility. A good life, we're told, is something we create, manage, and maintain through discipline and planning. This idea is comforting because it offers a sense of fairness to the world. If we are unhappy, it must mean we miscalculated somewhere. If something painful happens, perhaps we could have prevented it. The alternative, that life is shaped by forces far beyond our reach, is unbearable to consider. It makes us feel small, fragile, and exposed. And so we cling even tighter to the idea that we can determine outcomes through sheer will. We obsess over the right decisions, the right timing, the right habits, believing that if we master enough pieces of life, the whole will finally fall into place. But this belief is a double-edged blade. The more control we think we should have, the more we blame ourselves for every disappointment. Instead of accepting uncertainty as a natural companion of existence, we internalize it as a personal flaw. We agonize over relationships that fall apart, convinced that if we had said one more thoughtful sentence, if we had been kinder, calmer, less demanding, the other person would have stayed. We torture ourselves over careers that don't unfold the way we hoped, imagining that a different choice 5 years earlier would have changed everything. We feel ashamed of our emotional struggles, as if sadness or anxiety are marks of incompetence rather than parts of being human. We rewrite our pasts in endless loops, searching for the single detail we could have controlled that would have spared us from pain. This is how the illusion punishes us. It convinces us that the uncontrollable should have been within our grasp. The belief in control is seductive because it gives structure to chaos. It allows us to imagine we can protect ourselves from heartbreak, illness, loss, and disappointment. But the price is steep. We pay it for chronic anxiety, with self-criticism that borders on cruelty, with an inability to rest because rest feels like relinquishing the fragile grip that we think holds our lives together. We become hypervigilant, scanning the world for potential disasters, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. It is exhausting to live this way, yet we rarely admit that exhaustion to ourselves. We call it responsibility. We call it ambition. But deep down, it is fear masquerading as discipline. And underneath that fear lies a strange form of arrogance, though not the loud, boastful kind. It is the quiet arrogance of believing we're the central authors of every chapter of our lives. We forget how many things are shaped by chance. The family we are born into, the people we meet, the opportunities that appear at the exact moment we need them, the sudden tragedies that redraw our paths. We forget how often life surprises us in ways we could never have predicted. Yet we still hold ourselves to the impossible standard of having known better. We judge ourselves through the lens of hindsight as if we were supposed to have had foresight. And so we suffer not only from the pain of what happens, but from the belief that the pain should not have happened at all. The illusion becomes strongest in our relationships. We tell ourselves that love should be manageable, that conflicts should be preventable if we communicate correctly. We imagine that with enough emotional skill, we can keep the people we love safe, happy, and close. But love is one of the most uncontrollable forces we encounter. People change, feelings evolve, misunderstandings occur even between the most sincere hearts. Yet, when cracks appear, we feel personally defective, as though emotional unpredictability means we have failed in some way. We internalize the fantasy that intimacy should be tidy, predictable, followable like a manual. And when reality contradicts that, we descend into self-punishment. We try harder, speak softer, analyze deeper, and still we cannot eliminate uncertainty, because uncertainty is part of what it means to love someone who is not an extension of ourselves. The illusion also infiltrates our sense of identity. We believe we should be able to control our own minds, our impulses, our emotional reactions. When sadness arrives without warning, we feel guilty. When anxiety strikes, despite our efforts to stay calm, we feel weak. When old wounds resurface, we treat them as evidence that we are failing at adulthood. But the human psyche is not a device with buttons and switches. It is an ecosystem, a complex interplay of past experiences, inherited patterns, unconscious associations, and biological rhythms. We expect ourselves to manage this ecosystem with clinical precision, and when we can't, we treat the inability as a moral failure. In truth, we are only ever partly in charge of ourselves. The rest is a negotiation with forces we didn't choose and barely understand. At the heart of our misery is the belief that control equals safety. If we lose control, we fear that life will slip into chaos. But this belief is grounded in a misunderstanding. What protects us is not control, but adaptivity. Flexibility is what allows us to move through the unpredictability of existence without breaking. Acceptance is what allows us to stay open to moments of beauty even during times of uncertainty. And humility, the gentle recognition that we are not the authors of everything, is what saves us from drowning in misplaced guilt. When we release the need to control everything, life does not become more chaotic. It becomes more honest. We begin to see events not as verdicts on our worth, but as natural movements in a world governed by complexity. We become kinder to ourselves because we no longer expect perfection from a creature that is fundamentally limited. We learn to grieve without blaming ourselves, to hope without demanding guarantees, to love without needing certainty. We stop fighting the tides of life and start learning how to swim with them. What makes this shift difficult is that surrender feels like vulnerability. We imagine that if we stop trying to control everything, we will be exposed to pain. The truth is the opposite. The illusion of control does not protect us, it binds us. It chains us to impossible expectations and keeps us in a constant state of alertness. Letting go is not a collapse, but a release. It is the act of letting our lives be larger than our fears, letting relationships evolve without forcing them into rigid shapes, letting ourselves feel emotions without judging them as failures of discipline. To recognize what we cannot control is not defeat. It is wisdom. It is the slow, quiet acceptance that life is a collaboration between our choices and the world's unpredictability. We influence our paths, but we do not command them. And in that shared authorship, there is room for compassion toward ourselves, toward others, and toward the strange, magnificent uncertainty of being alive. If we can learn to live with less control, we may finally discover a life that is softer, clearer, and far more genuine than the one we've been trying so hard to manage. Because the truth is simple. Control was never the source of our safety. It was only the source of our exhaustion. What keeps us afloat is trust, not in the world, but in our ability to navigate it, even when we cannot predict where the currents will take us.
Yet we keep returning to the illusion again and again, because control carries with it a certain intoxication. It offers a fantasy where pain is optional and heartbreak is a solvable equation. It tells us that if we become wise enough, emotionally aware enough, spiritually mature enough, we can outsmart the unpredictable rhythms of life. We imagine that enlightenment will grant us immunity from chaos, that understanding ourselves will give us dominion over the world. But understanding is not a shield, it is a lantern. It illuminates the path, but it cannot change the terrain. No insight, no matter how profound, can prevent a loved one from drifting away, or stop the body from aging, or guarantee the arrival of opportunities. And yet we try, because to stop trying feels like surrendering to helplessness. This illusion is woven into our culture. We hear stories of people who took control of their destiny, as if destiny were a stubborn horse that can be tamed with the right grip. Inspirational narratives present life as a linear equation. Desire plus discipline equals success. These stories are comforting because they simplify a universe far too complex to fit into a neat formula. We rarely hear about the thousands of individuals who were equally disciplined, equally earnest, equally deserving, yet did not achieve the same endings because chance intervened in ways both subtle and brutal. The cultural worship of control is not merely misleading, it is cruel. It implies that those who suffer must have chosen poorly, must have failed to foresee, must have lacked willpower. It turns misfortune into accusation and vulnerability into a moral flaw. We internalize this judgment long before we are aware of it. As children, we are taught that mistakes are preventable, that consequences are lessons in disguise, that responsibility means anticipating problems before they arise. When something goes wrong, the first question asked is, "What did you do?" Not, "What happened?" This distinction matters. One implies fault, the other implies circumstance. We grow up believing that if we suffer, it must be our burden to fix it. And so we learn to hide our confusion, to suppress our fear, to pretend we are in control even when we feel lost. The world rewards the appearance of stability, not the honesty of uncertainty. But there is a cost to this performance. When we pretend to be in control, we cut ourselves off from genuine connection. We avoid sharing our vulnerabilities because we fear being judged for them. We minimize our struggles because we believe that admitting them makes us weak. We isolate ourselves behind curated versions of our lives, versions that feel safe but hollow. In the silence created by that isolation, anxiety grows. It whispers that everyone else seems to manage life better, that we alone are stumbling, that our inner chaos is evidence of personal failure. We forget that others are also performing, also pretending, also terrified of being seen as flawed. Control does not bring us closer to others, it pushes us further into solitude. At some point, usually much later than we'd like to admit, life confronts us with events that shatter the illusion entirely. The death of someone we love, the end of a relationship we believed was stable, the sudden collapse of a career, the unexpected diagnosis. These moments do not ask for our permission, they simply arrive. They expose the limits of our influence with an unforgiving clarity. We often respond with anger, not at the event itself, but at ourselves. We believe we should have anticipated it, prevented it, or at least prepared better. The intensity of this self-blame reveals just how deeply we internalize the myth of control. And yet, in the aftermath of these collapses, a strange quiet often follows. There is a moment, sometimes only a breath, sometimes a season, where we sense a flicker of liberation in the wreckage. When the illusion breaks, the pressure to micromanage life breaks with it. We see that control was never the foundation holding us together. We begin to realize that the world did not collapse because we loosened our grip. It collapsed because collapse is part of the world's natural rhythm. In that realization, grief and relief intermingle. We grieve the loss, but we also grieve the years spent exhausting ourselves in pursuit of a fantasy. Slowly, we begin to notice something else. There is a softer form of safety that does not come from dominance or foresight. It emerges from adaptability, from resilience, from the ability to stay gentle even when we are uncertain. True safety comes not from controlling the ocean, but from learning how to float. It comes from knowing that we can recover, not that we can prevent all storms. This shift is subtle but transformative. We stop viewing ourselves as the architects of every outcome and start viewing ourselves as participants in a larger, unpredictable landscape. We start valuing curiosity over certainty, exploration over rigidity, presence over prediction. The illusion of control cracks most deeply in our relationships. We enter love believing, sometimes unconsciously, that if we behave correctly, if we communicate well, if we choose the right moments, if we heal our wounds, we can create a love that will never leave, never disappoint, never drift. This belief is not naive, it is human. Love is too precious for us to accept its vulnerability without struggle. But love is not a machine, it is a living organism. It changes with seasons, with moods, with experience. Even the healthiest relationships encounter storms, misunderstandings, distance, quiet resentments, shifting needs. When we believe we should be able to control these fluctuations, we experience each one as a sign of failure. But when we accept their inevitability, something changes. We become more compassionate, more patient, more capable of staying present even when the connection feels fragile. Perhaps the most painful form of the illusion is the belief that we should be able to control our own minds. We imagine that emotional suffering is something we should be able to will away. Pain becomes a project. Sadness becomes a problem. Anxiety becomes evidence of inadequacy. We treat our inner landscape like a machine whose malfunction is our responsibility. But the mind is not mechanical, it is geological. Layers of memory sediment over years, shaped by pressures we barely understand. Old wounds reopen not because we choose them, but because the psyche is cyclical, revisiting its unresolved chapters in spirals rather than straight lines. When we stop expecting perfect emotional regulation, we create space for gentleness. We allow ourselves to feel without self-punishment. What we call control is often fear dressed in the language of competence. Fear of being hurt, fear of being abandoned, fear of meaninglessness, fear of chaos. The more frightened we are, the more tightly we grip the structures around us. But fear is not an enemy to be conquered. It is a messenger. It shows us where we feel most fragile, where we need comfort rather than discipline. When we allow fear to be acknowledged rather than suppressed, it softens. It becomes a companion instead of a tyrant. We begin to trust that we can experience fear without losing ourselves to it. As we loosen our reliance on control, another truth emerges, one that feels unsettling at first, but gradually becomes liberating. Life does not require our constant supervision. The world continues to turn without our vigilance. People grow, heal, forgive, change, even when we are not orchestrating their every movement. Opportunities appear when we least expect them, not because we calculated them, but because life is more expansive than our plans. We start to notice moments of unexpected grace, a conversation that repairs a misunderstanding, a chance meeting that transforms a trajectory, a quiet afternoon where peace arrives without reason. These moments reveal a deeper intelligence in the world, something organic, unpredictable, but strangely trustworthy. Control shrinks life into a narrow corridor where only the predictable is welcome. Letting go opens the windows. It allows life to surprise us again. It invites serendipity, creativity, tenderness. When we no longer demand certainty, we become available to wonder. We stop chasing perfection and start noticing beauty. We stop performing strength and start exploring honesty. We stop monitoring every possible future and start inhabiting the present with a fuller, more attentive heart. None of this is easy. Letting go of control feels like dissolving.
It requires grieving the identity we built around competence and foresight. It asks us to confront the terrifying possibility that we are not the authors of everything that happens. But in that confrontation lies a more spacious kind of peace. We discover that life does not require us to be omniscient. It asks us to be receptive. It asks us to be open to change, to remain flexible, to be willing to feel deeply even when we cannot predict what emotion will come next. And through that openness, we find a form of strength.
We find a form of strength that control never allowed. The strength to remain soft. The illusion of control makes us miserable because it demands that we live as gods in a world designed for humans. It asks for mastery where only participation is possible. It demands certainty in a universe defined by movement. But once we release the illusion, even briefly, we begin to see that life's unpredictability is not an error, but a feature. It is what gives rise to possibility, to renewal, to transformation. If everything were controllable, nothing would ever surprise us. Nothing would ever change us. Nothing would ever humble us into becoming wiser, gentler, more nuanced versions of ourselves. To live without the illusion is not to live in chaos. It is to live in alignment with reality. It is to recognize that we influence the world, but do not command it, that we shape our paths, but do not script them. It is to let life be a dialogue rather than a monologue. There is courage in that. There is tenderness in that. There is perhaps a deeper form of happiness, one rooted not in mastery, but in presence, not in certainty, but in trust, not in controlling life, but in participating in it fully, vulnerably, and with a heart willing to be changed.